Okay, let's dive in. Imagine finding like a major clue about brain health, or basically hiding right there in our DNA. There's some new research out, just published, and it seems to have found a pretty common gene variant tied to, well, a doubled risk of dementia. Now, that's already big news,
It's
right?
huge news, yeah.
But here's the really interesting bit, the twist. Based on what they found, this higher risk seems to mainly hit men.
That gender difference is, well, it's absolutely striking, isn't it? It just jumps right out at you. So yeah, we're really getting into a study looking at these links between our genes and the odds of developing dementia down the line.
And we're not talking about a small study here. This deep dive is based on some pretty solid findings that just came out in the journal Neurology. The study's called Hemochromatosis Genotypes and Incident Dementia in a Prospective Study of Older Adults.
Right.
And what really gives it weight, I think, is that it pulls data from that huge long-term project, the ASPREE trial. That's, this incredible resource tracking over 19,000 healthy older folks for years. Using that kind of massive forward-looking data, it just provides a really strong base for these kinds of discoveries.
Exactly. The ASPREE trial, I mean, it was initially set up to look at aspirin and healthy aging, but it created this perfect setup to watch all sorts of health outcomes over time, including cognitive decline and dementia.
Yeah.
It's data like that lets researchers spot these potentially hidden connections.
Okay, so our mission today is to really unpack this. We want to get into the specifics, like which exact gene variant are we talking about? Who does this study suggest is most at risk? And what are the researchers thinking about why this connection exists, especially with that gender split? And, what could it all mean going forward?
Right. So maybe let's start with the gene itself. The study zooms in on variations in the gene linked to hemochromatosis. That gene is called HFE.
HFE, got it. And that's the one that plays a big role in how our bodies manage iron, correct?
That's the one. And the specific variant they flagged in this research is called H63D.
H63D.
And it's actually pretty common to carry just one copy of this H63D variant. Something like 1 in 3 people has a single copy.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a big chunk of the population then. And like Professor John Olenek, one of the study's authors, pointed out, just having that one copy doesn't seem to affect health or dementia risk, at least based on what they saw in this study.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The real focus, the key group the study honed in on, is the smaller slice of people who have 2 copies of the H63D variant. That's less common, maybe around 1 in 36 people.
1 in 36. And this is where the really surprising result popped up. The study found that having 2 copies of H63D more than doubled the dementia risk over time. But, and this is the critical part, they saw the significantly higher risk only in the men in the study.
Yeah, that specific finding the gender difference tied to having those 2 copies, that's really what makes this research stand out, I think. It really suggests there's something complex going on, maybe involving sex hormones or other biological differences between men and women that affect how this gene variant expresses its risk.
And what's really interesting, especially since the HFE gene is all about iron, is that the researchers didn't actually find a direct link between high blood iron levels and this increased dementia risk in those men.
That's exactly the point Professor Olink stressed. He mentioned that even with the HFE gene's known job, their analysis showed, and I'm quoting roughly here, no direct link between iron levels in the blood and increased dementia risk in affected men, which strongly suggests, that having 2 copies of H63D might be causing trouble through completely different pathways.
So it's not necessarily the classic iron overload condition, hemochromatosis itself, that's driving the dementia risk here. It's something else triggered when a man has these 2 specific copies.
Precisely. The researchers are thinking, well, hypothesizing it could involve other things, maybe increased vulnerability to brain injury from inflammation, or perhaps cell damage happening elsewhere in the body, something downstream from the gene's main iron job. That seems to be the leading idea now, but it definitely needs more research.
And looping back to that initial twist, figuring out why the risk seems higher in men with 2 copies, but apparently not women, that's another huge area the researchers highlighted for future study. It's a big unanswered question right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just to quickly recap the main takeaway for you listening, this major new research, using that powerful ASPREE trial data, suggests that men who carry 2 copies of the HFE H63D gene variant seem to have a substantially higher risk, more than double, of developing dementia compared to others. And, importantly, They didn't observe this same link in the women in this particular study.
Right. And the potential implications here, as the researchers themselves brought up, are pretty significant. Professor Paula Kazi, another co-author, basically said that figuring out why this higher risk exists for men with this specific genetic makeup, well, that could really open doors to more targeted, more personalized ways to prevent and maybe even treat dementia later on.
Yeah. He even floated the idea that, since testing for the HFE gene is already kind of common for checking hemochromatosis risk, maybe this kind of genetic testing could potentially be offered more widely to men as a way to identify those who might be at higher risk based on these specific findings.
It really drives home that point, doesn't it? While you can't change your genes, understanding exactly what they're doing and which biological pathways they're influencing, like that potential inflammation or cell damage Professor Olenek mentioned, that could give us specific targets for future treatments or interventions.
Exactly. This study, it doesn't solve the whole dementia puzzle, obviously, but it adds a really, really interesting piece. It points to a specific genetic connection and hints at biological processes that might be especially relevant in men. It really shows the value of these huge long-term studies for uncovering these subtle but potentially crucial links.
So maybe here's something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. If this common genetic variant mainly affects men, potentially by influencing specific pathways like inflammation or cell damage in the brain, pathways that future therapies might actually be able to target, what does that finding really open up in terms of how we understand and maybe eventually address dementia risk, even when we can't change the underlying genetic code itself?